What if I told you that the greatest crusade, led by a holy king, did not perish by the enemy's sword, but drowned in muddy water? The Seventh Crusade, led by none other than King Louis IX of France himself, was the ideal of European chivalry and Christian piety. He assembled a colossal army, had a strategic plan, and was confident of a swift victory over the infidels in Egypt, which was considered the key to Jerusalem. No one in Europe could have imagined that this illustrious army would suffer one of the most humiliating and catastrophic military disasters in Western history. This story is not just a chronicle of defeat, but a dramatic tale of how overconfidence, ignorance of the terrain, and the genius of an Eastern commander turned the great Nile River against their enemies. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the great Nile turned into a huge trap teeming with monsters, drowning not only the French king's army, but also his own freedom. What if I told you that everything you believed was a lie? The story of the Seventh Crusade began not with victories, but with the unprecedented confidence of the French King Louis IX, who considered himself personally chosen by God for great deeds. After Jerusalem was finally lost to the Christians in 1244, it was Louis, a pious and determined monarch, who took on the mission of revenge. He carefully prepared for the campaign for 6 years, gathering enormous resources, the best knights of his kingdom, and a modern fleet. Upon arriving in Cyprus, he made a strategically important decision. Instead of attacking Palestine, he decided to strike at the very heart of the enemy's power, Egypt. To begin with, the king chose Damietta, a powerful port fortress at the mouth of the Nile, as his first target. He was confident that the capture of this key city would give the Crusaders not only a foothold, but also valuable leverage in negotiations with the Egyptian Sultan. Louis's army landed on the Egyptian coast in June 1249, and the landing was almost perfect. Knights in shining armor poured onto the shore, immediately overwhelming the few defenders. Damietta fell incredibly quickly, just 2 days after the landing, which came as a shock to the entire Muslim world. The frightened and demoralized garrison fled the city, leaving it virtually untouched in the hands of the Crusaders. For Louis, this was confirmation of divine favor and his own infallible righteousness, strengthening his fatalistic conviction that victory was near. Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, who ruled Egypt, was seriously ill and bedridden, and his troops were unprepared for such a swift attack. The French army celebrated its first, easy success, but it was this very ease that sowed the seeds of future defeat. Instead of immediately building on his success and moving south towards the capital, Cairo, Louis made his first critical mistake. He remained in Damietta for 6 whole months. The king explained the delay by the need to wait for the end of the Nile's seasonal flooding and the arrival of reinforcements, but in reality, his army sank into idleness and relaxation. The knights, cut off from discipline, began to behave like conquerors, plundering and raping the local population. This period of inactivity was a gift to the Egyptians. While the Crusaders enjoyed the comforts of Damietta, Cairo was consolidating its forces and strengthening its defenses. Despite his illness, the Sultan managed to take decisive measures, appointing his commander Fakhr ad-Din Yusuf to be responsible for the defense. The city of Mansurah, located on the banks of the Nile, was chosen as the main stronghold for repelling the Crusaders. The Egyptian side used the precious time to build powerful fortifications and gather all available troops from Syria and other regions. Mansurah, which translates as victorious, had been founded only a few decades earlier, but its location was strategically ideal. It was located in the very center of a maze of Nile canals, branches, and marshy channels, which made it extremely difficult for large cavalry forces to approach. Egyptian engineers and workers reinforced the banks, dug new canals, and built temporary bridges that could be quickly destroyed or burned. They turned the surrounding area into a veritable fortification system, ideal for defense. In November 1249, an event occurred that was to be fatal for the Egyptians, but backfired on the Crusaders. Sultan as-Salih Ayyub died. His death was concealed by his wife, Shajar al-Dur, a woman of incredible willpower and political talent. She ruled the country and the army on behalf of her deceased husband, forging his signature on orders. This gave the Egyptians time to wait for the arrival of the heir and prevent panic among the troops. At the end of November, Louis IX finally made up his mind and gave the order to attack Cairo. The army left Damietta and moved south, but their path was blocked by a powerful Egyptian camp located on the opposite bank of a branch of the Nile known as Bahr al-Sagir, or Little Sea. This was the final frontier before Mansurah. The two armies stood facing each other, separated by a narrow but deep and fast-flowing channel that was impossible to cross. The Crusaders faced an insurmountable obstacle. The Egyptians prevented them from building a bridge, constantly firing at them with siege weapons and trebuchets. The French began feverishly searching for a ford or a way to cross the water, which seemed to be their only enemy. The unexpected obstacle ruined their entire initial ambitious plan. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented about Louis's fatal delay? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Ready to learn the main secret of the Egyptians that allowed them to win, but was ignored by European historians for a long time? From the very beginning of the siege in December 1249, the situation of the Crusaders was extremely difficult and tense. They stood on the shore, unable to cross, and were attacked every day by the Egyptians under the command of Fakhr ad-Din. Stones thrown from catapults and fire, known as Greek fire, rained down on their positions, creating not only physical danger, but also powerful psychological stress for the knights. Greek fire was one of the most terrifying weapons of the time. It could not be extinguished with water, and any contact with it resulted in burns and panic among the troops. For the Crusaders, it was a new and frightening experience that caused fear and confusion. With each new volley, their morale fell, and attempts to organize a defense became increasingly difficult. Louis's attempts to build a pontoon bridge were unsuccessful. Every time the knights tried to connect the sections of the bridge, Egyptian archers and Greek fire throwers attacked them with great accuracy. All the efforts of the Crusaders were destroyed in a matter of minutes, and the bridge could not be built. The knights quickly realized that a direct crossing of the canal with their forces was impossible without enormous losses. The situation seemed hopeless. Louis saw his troops being depleted and morale falling. Each clash with the Egyptians brought new losses and demoralized the soldiers. The direct path to success was closed, and the king began to look for unconventional solutions. And then an unexpected miracle happened for the Crusaders. A local Bedouin came forward and, for a generous reward, agreed to show them a secret ford across the canal. He knew that a sandbar allowed them to cross Bahr as-Sagir, bypassing the main Egyptian fortifications. This knowledge proved crucial, opening up a path that had previously seemed insurmountable. King Louis immediately accepted this risky plan. He decided to use the secret crossing for a shock cavalry group that could launch a surprise attack on the Egyptian camp. His brother, Robert III of Artois, led the vanguard, ready to deliver a sudden and decisive blow, distracting the enemy's main forces. On the morning of February 8, 1250, under cover of fog, the vanguard of the Crusaders, consisting of the Templars and the Count of Artois' detachment, moved towards the ford indicated by the Bedouin. The crossing was more successful than could have been expected, although the water was deeper and faster flowing. The knights overcame the obstacle and reached the opposite bank, finding themselves directly on the flank of the unsuspecting Egyptian camp. The attack was completely unexpected. The Count of Artois' cavalry stormed the camp, taking the Egyptians by surprise. Faridin Yusuf, the commander of the troops, was killed in the first few minutes, before he even had time to put on his armor. The Egyptian soldiers, deprived of their leader, panicked and began a chaotic retreat. However, the victory proved to be deceptive. Count Robert d'Artois, blinded by the easy victory, ignored the king's instructions and the advice of the Templars. He decided that success was already in his hands and led the vanguard straight to Mansurah. It was pure arrogance that ignored Louis's strategic plan and the dangers of an urban ambush. The Egyptians, sheltered behind the walls of Mansurah, had prepared a trap. In the narrow streets of the city, the cavalry lost its advantage, and the Mamluks, Fakhr ad-Din's elite warriors, organized their defense. The city streets became a real disaster for the French vanguard. In the ensuing massacre, the vanguard of the Crusaders was virtually destroyed. Count Artois was killed, along with most of the Templars and Knights. The loss of this detachment was not only tragic for Louis, but also a serious blow to the army's combat capability, as the most experienced warriors died along with the vanguard. But knowledge of the terrain was only half the battle. The Egyptians used their fortifications as a deadly weapon, ready to find out how their defensive structures became their main advantage in battle. Mansurah was carefully fortified and designed to neutralize the advantage of cavalry. Narrow streets and high walls turned a direct confrontation into a trap, where the numerical superiority and strength of the knights lost their significance. Every building, every street, and every passageway was prepared to meet the attackers. The Mamluks set up ambushes, attacking from rooftops and alleys, creating chaos and destruction among their enemies. The defensive structures allowed the Egyptians to control the pace of battle. They could lure the Crusaders into a trap where they lost their organization and discipline. It was a mastery of tactical engineering that surpassed the simple power of weapons. Every battle in Mansurah became a test of endurance and strategy. The Egyptians used the city to exhaust their opponents as much as possible, turning the streets into a deadly maze for the knights. Thus, the Egyptians' victory can be explained not only by personal valor and the number of warriors, but also by the skillful use of the terrain and architecture. Their fortifications were not just a defense, but an active weapon capable of breaking any enemy. Hidden passages, fortified gates, and pre-prepared positions for archers and fire throwers created conditions in which the Crusaders lost their cavalry advantage. Even the most experienced knights, accustomed to open battlefields, encountered unexpected obstacles and traps. This made their attacks chaotic and costly in terms of losses. The Egyptian strategy combined knowledge of the terrain, preparation of city fortifications, and discipline of the troops. Every move of the enemy was anticipated and controlled, making Mansurah almost impregnable. It was this combination of knowledge of the terrain, fortifications, and troop discipline that made the Egyptians invincible in Mansurah, turning their defensive structures into a key weapon against the powerful Crusader army. What if I showed you a time machine? The real heroes of Mansurah's defense were the Sultan's elite guard, the Mamluks, who represented a completely new military force in the Middle East. These slave warriors, recruited mainly from Turkic and Caucasian peoples, were fanatically devoted to their cause and distinguished themselves by their high level of combat training. It was they, not the Sultan's stunned soldiers, who took the first blow in the city. As soon as Count Artois' cavalry broke into the city quarters, the Mamluks locked the gates, cutting off their retreat. The knights found themselves trapped in a maze of narrow streets, where their heavy armor and powerful horses became more of a hindrance than an advantage. In these conditions, the Mamluks, armed with light sabers and bows, had a huge advantage. One of the most talented and ambitious Mamluk commanders, Baybars, who would later become Sultan himself, took charge of the counterattack. He ordered the archers to fire continuously from the roofs and windows, and the infantry to use improvised barricades. Baybars quickly realized that they had to prevent the Crusaders from using their famous battering ram. Meanwhile, hearing the noise of battle, King Louis IX, who had just ferried his main army across, moved towards Mansurah. He did not know of his brother's death, but he understood that the vanguard was in trouble. Louis's troops were attacked by the Mamluks, commanded by the same Baybars, who had come out of the city. The battle raged right between the city and the canal. Despite the dire situation, King Louis IX showed incredible personal bravery, fighting in the front ranks of his infantry. He was seriously wounded, but his presence on the battlefield inspired the soldiers. It was one of those moments when the personal valor of a monarch saved the entire army from complete defeat. At night, the Mamluks launched several desperate attacks on the Crusaders' camp, trying to sow panic and destroy their food supplies. However, the French managed to erect powerful earthen ramparts and palisades, and they managed to repel all attacks, suffering heavy losses in the process. The defense turned into an exhausting, round-the-clock struggle for survival. After the death of Count Artois, the Egyptians took complete control of the canals, turning them into their main weapon. They blocked the Bahr al-Saghir canal downstream and began to build new barricades. This prevented the French from using the waterway to bring in food and transport the wounded. Soon, famine and epidemics began in the Crusader camp. Unsanitary conditions, overcrowding, poor water, and a lack of fresh provisions led to outbreaks of dysentery and scurvy. The stench of thousands of corpses that could not be buried poisoned the air, undermining morale. After the battle on February 8-11, there was a temporary lull, but it was deceptive. Louis's army, exhausted by losses, disease, and constant night attacks, was slowly but surely losing its combat effectiveness. At the same time, the Egyptians, having received a new sultan, Turan Shah, found unity and were ready for the final blow. Like this video if you think that King Louis IX's personal courage at that moment was a fatal mistake rather than an act of heroism. What if everything you've been taught is outdated and doesn't reflect reality? In fact, the forces of nature and a lack of discipline did much more damage to the Crusaders than all the Mamluk sabers combined. After the first battles at Mansurah, Louis IX's army found itself in a classic trap. Advancing on Cairo was impossible, and retreating back to Damietta would mean admitting complete defeat and losing all authority. The camp became a battlefield not only with the enemy, but also with invisible enemies, hunger, disease, and environmental elements that seemed insurmountable. The most terrible of these invisible enemies was dysentery, which spread rapidly among the soldiers and destroyed their strength. Historians of the time describe horrific scenes. People lay in the mud, emaciated and dehydrated, suffering from vomiting and bloody diarrhea, unable even to stand up. The disease claimed the lives not only of ordinary infantrymen, but also of knights, accustomed to fine food and comfort, which were unavailable in these conditions. Food supplies delivered from Damietta dwindled with each passing day. New supplies were unavailable, as the Egyptians blocked all routes and captured any wagons that tried to break through to the camp. Food prices skyrocketed, and soon the soldiers were forced to eat their horses, and sometimes rodents, to survive until the next day. The Egyptian fleet took complete control of the river. All the Crusader ships that attempted to deliver provisions or supplies were sunk or captured. This completely broke the army's morale, making any attempt at resupply virtually futile. Louis IX found himself in a powerless position, unable to break the blockade, and the river became his main enemy. Realizing the criticality of the situation, Louis IX made a last-ditch attempt to negotiate with the Egyptian Sultan. He offered to exchange Damietta for Jerusalem in order to ensure a safe exit for his troops and save face. But Sultan Turan Shah, sensing the weakness of the Crusaders, rejected the offer and demanded complete and unconditional surrender. demonstrating the determination and cruelty of the Egyptian side. King Louis IX himself was in an extremely weakened state, suffering from dysentery. He could barely stand and was no longer able to personally command the army. His physical weakness completely demoralized the soldiers, who saw their once invincible leader slowly fading away and losing strength, which instilled despair. In April 1250, after almost 2 months of siege, Louis IX made the only possible decision to order a retreat to Damietta. This was not just a military maneuver, but an admission of the complete failure of the entire campaign, a realization that the army's forces did not allow it to continue the offensive. The retreat of a weakened, sick army is always the most dangerous and risky part of any military operation. The retreat plan included both a land route and the use of riverboats to evacuate the seriously wounded and sick. But the Egyptians completely controlled the river, and the waterway was blocked before the army could begin its movement, depriving it of the possibility of a safe retreat. Many of the wounded were doomed, as transportation was impossible and medical care was limited. The retreat began on the night of April 5th to reduce the risk of encountering the Mamluks in daylight. The troops left the fortified camp in complete silence, trying to maintain the element of surprise. But even the night march did not allow them to completely escape. The Mamluks, who were nearby, instantly noticed the movement and began to pursue them. The rear guard of the Crusaders found itself in a particularly difficult situation. The Mamluks attacked it with incredible speed, using every chance to attack and destroy the formation. The soldiers fought with their last ounce of strength, but fatigue, hunger, and disease undermined their capabilities. In addition, every step of the retreat was complicated by a lack of supplies and the constant fear of pursuit. The men lost not only their combat effectiveness, but also their psychological stability. Panic and fatigue became enemies on the battlefield. Louis IX, observing the situation, understood that his army would not be able to withstand a prolonged retreat. Every decision about the route, speed of movement, and distribution of troops was vital. A mistake could cost the lives of hundreds of soldiers. Even the most experienced commanders felt the pressure of the circumstances. Night maneuvers, the need for secrecy, and the need to care for sick and hungry soldiers required incredible concentration. Every day of the march to Damietta was a struggle against hunger, disease, weather, and relentless attacks. The army was exhausted and demoralized, and hope for salvation hung by a thread. But even the retreat did not end the king's torment. In the next chapter, you will learn what happened next. The retreat turned into a rout. The weakened soldiers, suffering from dysentery, could not keep up with the fast pace of movement, while the Mamluk cavalry constantly attacked the flanks and rear guard. The Egyptians acted ruthlessly, giving the Crusaders no respite and sparing no one. Louis IX's troops did not manage to get far from Mansurah. Near the town of Fariska, just a few kilometers from their camp, the Mamluks caught up with and surrounded the main part of the retreating army. It was no longer a battle, but a systematic destruction. King Louis IX himself was too weak to ride. He was carried on a stretcher and tried with all his might to inspire his remaining men. However, his presence could no longer change the course of the disaster. At that moment, on the Sultan's orders, the Egyptians launched their final assault. The Mamluks, filled with fighting spirit, broke through the ranks of the Crusaders, who were no longer able to offer any organized resistance. The final battle took place near the village of Miniala. Here, on the banks of the Nile, the last organized units of the French army were finally defeated. The soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to escape by swimming, but the current of the Nile and the Egyptian boats quickly sealed their fate. A small group of knights and the king's personal guard took refuge in the village. Louis IX, surrounded by his loyal men, refused to flee and surrendered only when it became clear that further resistance was pointless and would lead to the death of his last comrades. Wounded, exhausted by illness and dehydration, King Louis IX of France was captured by Egyptian warriors. Witnesses described his condition as half-dead. He was unable to even move on his own. A huge number of French aristocrats and knights were taken prisoner along with him. According to various estimates, the number of prisoners reached 15,000, including the seriously wounded and sick. It was an unprecedented humiliation for European knighthood. The king's capture was the culmination of the entire disaster. The Seventh Crusade, which began with such brilliance and confidence, ended in a shameful defeat. The entire army, assembled over 6 years, was destroyed in less than 2 months. Want to know how one woman saved an entire army? After the king's capture and the destruction of his army, the Egyptian Sultan Turan Shah faced a dilemma. What to do with such a high-ranking prisoner? The capture of the king, who was considered the most powerful monarch in Europe, was a great victory, but also a huge responsibility. The Egyptian command understood that Louis IX was worth a fortune, and they set astronomical conditions for his release. They demanded a ransom of 1 million gold bezants. It was a colossal sum, equal to France's annual income. Louis IX, despite his situation, did not lose his composure and showed remarkable honor and dignity. He agreed to pay the entire amount, but with one important condition. He would cover only half of the amount, and the other half would have to be paid by the order of the Knights Templar. He also agreed to surrender Damietta. At that moment, a political coup took place in Cairo. Sultan Turan Shah, who had not yet managed to consolidate his power, was killed by the same Mamluks who had won the victory at Mansurah, including Berbers. Power temporarily passed to Shajar al-Dur, the widow of the previous sultan, who became the first female ruler in the Islamic world. Shajar al-Dur showed political wisdom. She confirmed the agreement with Louis. The French returned Damietta, and the ransom payments began. Louis IX, without waiting for the full payment of the entire amount, insisted on the immediate release of his soldiers and wounded. In May 1250, after almost 2 months of captivity, King Louis IX and the surviving Crusaders were released. This was not just a release, but confirmation that for the Egyptians, the value of Damietta and the ransom was higher than the risk of holding a European monarch captive. Louis IX left Egypt with the remnants of his army, but instead of returning immediately to France, he decided to remain in the Middle East for another 4 years. His main task was to strengthen the Christian fortresses that still remained in Palestine and to continue his diplomatic efforts. The cost of the disaster was terrible. According to various estimates, France lost up to 30,000 people, including a significant part of its elite. The financial losses were no less catastrophic. The ambush was effective, but how did Louis IX cope with the long years of captivity, and how did he change after the defeat? In the next chapter, we will talk about his unique system of logistics and survival. The disaster at Mansurah had long-term and profound consequences, not only for France, but for all of Europe and the Middle East. This defeat symbolized that the era of the Great Crusades was gradually becoming a thing of the past, and that the old ideas of chivalry and glory were insufficient for real warfare. Despite his personal courage and strategic efforts, Louis IX faced insurmountable forces of nature, disease, and the skill of his enemies. The king's defeat was a turning point in the history of the Crusades, symbolizing not only the collapse of a specific expedition, but also the beginning of the gradual decline of the whole idea of Christian expansion into the East. Europe began to realize that direct intervention in the affairs of the East required much more complex resources, organization, and strategic thinking than had previously been thought. In France, the defeat and capture of Louis IX caused real shock and grief among the population and the nobility. But royal power was not broken, thanks to the efforts of the Queen Mother, who took control of the country during her son's absence. She was able to maintain stability, keep the kingdom from internal turmoil, and raise funds for the king's ransom, demonstrating incredible determination and wisdom. The financial losses suffered by France were enormous. The ransom of 1 million Byzants, added to the cost of the campaign itself, depleted the royal treasury and threatened the country's economic stability. To cover these costs, additional taxes were introduced, which placed a heavy burden on the population, causing discontent and social tension. For the Middle East, the victory at Mansurah was of decisive strategic importance. It not only saved Egypt from the invasion of the Crusaders, but also contributed to the consolidation of the new power, the Mamluk dynasty. It was the Mamluks, led by Baibars, who became the main force that in the following decades finally expelled the Crusaders from the eastern territories, forming a new system of defense and administration. Louis IX, returning to France after a 4-year stay in the East, had changed. He remained deeply religious, but became more judicious and cautious in his political decisions. Personal defeats made him more attentive to the details of diplomacy and domestic policy, transforming a self-confident warrior into a mature, wise ruler. The disaster at Mansurah finally undermined Europeans' belief in the success of large-scale crusades. Europe began to realize that the strength of knightly cavalry and religious enthusiasm were no longer sufficient to conquer the East. From that moment on, the strategic initiative passed entirely to the Muslim rulers, who began to strengthen their territories and create a sustainable defense system. Despite the defeat, Louis IX did not abandon the idea of a crusade. His faith and desire to protect the holy sites remained unchanged. 2 decades later, in 1270, he undertook his last 8th expedition to the east, which, unfortunately, ended with his death in Tunisia, demonstrating the tragic price of idealism. Mansurah was not just a single battle. It was the moment when European expansion to the east reached its peak and then began to gradually decline. The Mamluks' victory showed that an organized and disciplined force, backed by knowledge of the terrain and strategic thinking, could stand up to even the most famous knights. The defeat and consequences of Mansurah also had an impact on European military thinking. It became clear that knightly valor, without the support of logistics, medicine, and competent command, was not enough to ensure success in a long-term campaign. Europe began to gradually transition to more centralized and organized armies, where discipline and strategy were valued above personal glory. The economic consequences of Mansurah were felt not only in the royal treasury. Financial difficulties affected the entire social structure of France, forcing the nobility to seek new sources of income and ordinary people to endure higher taxes. This experience became a lesson for future European monarchs about the need to balance military ambitions with economic stability. The Mamluks, having strengthened their positions, began to actively develop Egypt's defense systems and fortify their fortresses. This created obstacles for new expeditions and strengthened control over strategically important territories. The events of Mansurah demonstrated the importance of combining military force with knowledge of the terrain. After his return, Louis IX began to pay more attention to domestic policy and strengthening the country. He used the lessons of defeat to reform the army, improve logistics, and prepare for future conflicts, emphasizing rationality and long-term strategy rather than emotional, heroic decisions. Thus, Mansurah became a symbol of the end of the era of knightly campaigns and the beginning of a new era when success depended on organization, discipline, and political wisdom. It showed that the power of the sword must be backed up by knowledge, patience, and the ability to act strategically. Its significance went beyond a single event. Mansurah demonstrated to the entire Christian world that the eastern states had learned to effectively defend their territories and wage war of attrition using geography, climate, and enemy strategy. The Mamluk state, which arose from the ruins of the Crusaders' defeat, was a unique phenomenon. Mansurah became their baptism of fire and a symbol of their power. Their victory was due not only to the overconfidence of the French, but also to their own military organization. The Mamluks, former slave warriors, formed the elite of the Egyptian army. They were extremely dedicated to their cause and trained in complex tactics that combined Turkish horseback archery with traditional Middle Eastern cavalry attacks. Their discipline was unquestionable. It was the Mamluks who were the first to recover from Count Artois' surprise attack and organize a defense in the narrow streets of Mansurah. They used ambushes and sniper fire from rooftops, which was completely unfamiliar to European knights, who preferred open combat. The key factor was the skillful use of the terrain and water barriers. Mamluk engineers and commanders quickly realized that the best tactic against the heavy French cavalry was to turn their advantage into a disadvantage by luring them into swamps and canals. The Egyptians' dominance on the water, achieved with their light, maneuverable boats, was fatal. Not only did they cut off supply lines, but they also constantly attacked the Crusaders' camp from the water, giving them no rest day or night. The psychological effect of the battle with the Mamluks was enormous. Their ferocity, sudden attacks, and skill with weapons inspired terror. European chronicles are full of descriptions of their fearlessness and incredible physical fitness. The victory at Mansurah proved that the military art of the East could be more adapted to local conditions than the European knightly army. The Mamluks used asymmetrical tactics, winning through discipline, knowledge of the terrain, and maneuverability. In the Battle of Mansurah, the Egyptians demonstrated not only the physical power of their troops, but also their technological superiority, which was a decisive factor at that moment. The Mamluks and engineers of Egypt used all available weapons and cunning tricks, turning every aspect of the battle into a trap for the Crusaders. One of the most effective and terrifying weapons was Greek fire. This mixture, the secret of which had been lost by Byzantium, remained in the arsenal of the Muslims and was used with terrifying accuracy. Based on petroleum components, it was virtually impossible to extinguish with water. Upon contact with moisture, the fire only intensified, turning any nearby surface into a source of ignition. For knights clad in steel armor, contact with Greek fire was a nightmare. The metal heated up, and unbearable heat built up under the armor, causing panic and disorientation. Egyptian engineers actively used siege engines, including trebuchets, catapults, and complex throwing devices. Constant shelling of French positions destroyed their structures, destroyed pontoon bridges, and prevented them from concentrating on organizing the crossing. Each attack was accompanied by loud noise, stone throwing, and incendiary shells, which further demoralized the soldiers and weakened their fighting spirit. Particular attention was paid to the use of terrain and hydraulic structures. The Nile canals and shallow waterways became natural defensive lines and, at the same time, traps. The Egyptians built temporary dams, bridges, and embankments that could be instantly destroyed or opened, causing flooding in low-lying areas and disrupting the advance of the Crusaders. Understanding the topography allowed the Mamluks to create chaos by controlling the enemy's movement and depriving them of safe routes. Equally important was the strategy of concealing information. After the death of Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, his wife Shajar al-Dur skillfully concealed this fact. She forged the Sultan's signature on orders, continued to send out his meals, and maintained the illusion that the ruler was alive. This prevented panic among the troops and allowed the Mamluks to remain organized and ready for defense, preventing the Crusaders from taking advantage of the internal chaos. The Mamluks also masterfully used psychological warfare. They knew of the Crusaders' deep fear of Greek fire and regularly used it in their bombardments, creating a sense of complete unpredictability and threat. Night raids, surprise attacks, and noisy assaults disrupted the soldiers' sleep, deprived them of concentration, and made them doubt their own strength. These actions increased the physical exhaustion of Louis IX's army and the psychological pressure on the command. In addition, the Egyptians actively used reconnaissance and disinformation. They tracked the movements of the French, observed the construction of camps and battles for crossings, creating the illusion of numerical superiority and intimidating the Crusaders. Every action, whether throwing incendiary shells or blocking supplies, was designed to have the maximum psychological effect. Thus, the Egyptian victory at Mansurah was the result not only of the personal courage of the Mamluks, but also of a comprehensive approach that included the use of Greek fire, engineering structures, hydraulic engineering, intelligence, and psychological tactics. Each element of the defense was carefully thought out, turning the confrontation into a series of carefully planned traps in which the Crusaders found themselves almost completely helpless. The Battle of Mansurah has gone down in history as one of the most striking examples of how an army with numerical and technological superiority can be completely defeated due to strategic miscalculations and a lack of discipline. This catastrophe served as a lesson for all of Europe and clear proof that bravery and chivalry do not always determine the outcome of a battle if logistics, intelligence, and knowledge of the terrain are ignored. The legacy of Mansurah is multifaceted and encompasses military, political, and cultural aspects. Mansurah was a turning point that marked the end of the Crusades. It showed that European monarchs could no longer easily defeat Muslim armies on their own territory. After this defeat, the major European monarchs became much more cautious about financing distant expeditions, realizing the risk of huge losses and the low probability of strategic success. Louis IX's campaign became a symbol of the limitations of Christian kings' ambitions, highlighting the limits of Western military power in the East. The Mamluks' victory at Mansurah marked the beginning of a new era in Egyptian history. The Mamluks, who demonstrated discipline and an ability to exploit technological and geographical advantages, soon established a powerful state that became the center of political and military power in the Middle East. They finally expelled the remaining Crusaders, and Mamluk sultans, such as Baybars, became the main defenders of Islamic lands, creating a strong military and administrative system capable of resisting any external threats. The personal fate of Louis IX added tragedy and symbolism to the history of Mansurah. The king was captured, endured severe trials, but after returning to France, he became one of the most just, wise, and cautious rulers of his time. His personal transformation from a warlike crusader to a mature statesman became a lesson for future generations about the value of experience, defeat, and responsibility. In 1297, Louis was canonized by the Catholic Church and went down in history as Saint Louis, a symbol of faith, piety, and patience, even though his crusade ended in disaster. From the point of view of military art, Mansurah became an important lesson for all European commanders. It clearly demonstrated the importance of reconnaissance, accurate knowledge of the terrain, adaptation of tactics to enemy conditions, and proper logistics. Failure to meet these conditions, as in the case of Count Robert of Artois' reckless vanguard, could lead to complete disaster, even if the army is equipped with the most modern weapons and elite troops. This lesson remained relevant in subsequent centuries. Preparation, discipline, and the ability to use geographical and technological advantages could determine the outcome of a battle more than the bravery of individual knights. The Nile became a symbol of defeat and the unpredictability of nature. The river, which was supposed to serve as a link and a path to victory, turned into a deadly trap that swallowed up a significant part of the knights' army. This river became a reminder that natural and geographical conditions can be a crucial factor in military campaigns, capable of nullifying all strategic and tactical efforts. The story of Mansurah is not just a tale of defeat, but also a profound reflection on the realities of war and human vanity. Even the most noble, righteous, and seemingly godly goals can be shattered by the harsh realities of war, technological limitations, and command errors. Mansurah will forever be remembered as the place where the dream of the Holy Land was drowned in the waters of the Great Nile, becoming a symbol of lost ambitions and a lesson for future generations of warriors and politicians. This battle showed that victory or defeat is not only a matter of personal valor, but also a complex set of factors: discipline, training, knowledge, the ability to use the terrain, and technological innovations. That is why Mansurah has become a monument to both human courage and the deadly fragility of ambition. We conclude our immersion in the dramatic history of the Seventh Crusade and the Battle of Mansurah. It was a story of how overconfidence and impatience clashed with discipline and genius in the use of terrain. The story of Louis IX is a timeless reminder that in war, it is not the one who believes in his own infallibility who wins, but the one who is better prepared and knows the battlefield better. Which of King Louis IX's tactical mistakes do you think was the most fatal? The fateful delay at Damietta, or the reckless throw of the Count of Artois? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the military tricks of the past.